Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of Sloan the Record, recording on January 23rd, releasing on January 26th, 2025. My name is Nathan Sloan, and I'm joined by my father, Ron. Each week, we're going on the record about family history, past and present. Along the way, we'll see if we can't learn more of the people, traditions, values, and stories that made us, all while opening a window for everyone else to see a little slice of life in rural North Carolina. New episodes are published on Sundays, and we appreciate every listener. You can make sure you catch each episode by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or Podbean. Just search Sloan the Record. Hi, Dad. How are you doing?
Oh, doing good. Doing good. Hope you are.
We just finished up. Basically, the last 4 episodes have been biographical episodes about your parents. So, we're going to turn the attention a little bit back on you and your experiences in life now, and that starts with your earliest memories of life in the 1950s as a kid in Broadway, North Carolina. When I was thinking about how I would come up with questions about this time of life, you think about it and you go, I don't have a whole lot of memories from the first 5 years. If I looked at my 1986 was when I was born. Really, I don't remember a whole lot before 1991. If you were to ask me about 1991 to 1995 or 6, I probably have more memories of elementary school and stuff like that. So I thought, well, let me think of what the very earliest memory I have just to share anecdotally. And that was maybe not the very earliest memory, but one of the early memories that I have was the sealing of the Four Oaks time capsule for the centennial of Four Oaks. And I don't know why that stuck out to me, but I do have memories, and if you go there to the Barbers Grove Park today, you'll see the time capsule, and it's got a notice on it that says it's to be opened on March 11th, 2089. And so I have to, presumably that means it was March 11th, 1989 when it was sealed. And if that's the case, that was less than a month before I turned 3 years old. So I was still 2 years old and have a memory. That's pretty interesting to me. Cool that I have some kind of memory. But the only thing I really remember about it was there was a kid there who, of course, he looked like a big kid to me. I remember looking up at him. I don't know if I was seated in a stroller still at 2 years old. Maybe it was one of those festivals or events and there were kids everywhere, and Mom thought, I'm not going to be able to keep track of him if I don't put him in a stroller. But I feel like I was seated or sitting down and looking up at this kid, and he held up a box for the video game for Nintendo Entertainment System, Legend of Zelda, the original first one. It's kind of a gold-colored box. And if I'm remembering correctly, he said something to the effect of, I want to put this in the time capsule. Oops, I think I hit my thing. I want to put this in the time capsule as a way of showing kids in the future what the latest in toys and entertainment, what kids were playing with in 1989. I don't know if he put the box in there or put something else in there. I can't imagine he would put the video game in there, because what kid would get rid of their video game? But if some relative, if I don't make it to 2089, hopefully some relative of mine will go there and verify my memory and see if there is something to do with The Legend of Zelda, because that would mean that I do have this very, very early memory from when I was almost, but not quite, 3 years old. So with that being said, I have to ask, what is a very early memory of yours, Dad?
Some of the earliest, I guess, kind of are centered around Christmas. I remember early Christmases, my parents would get a Sears catalog in the fall of the year, and they'd also get a Sears Christmas catalog. And it had, the primary thing for us was it had a huge toy section. And our parents would let us go through and pick out something that each one of us could pick out something we wanted. And a lot of my memories are around the things that we looked for and getting Christmas trees, things like that. Everything kind of centered around that little house in Broadway up on the hill. That it was a 2-bedroom house, and there were 5 of us living there at that time. And my brother and I shared a bed, and then my sister was on another bed, but in the same room. She was right much younger. And, Christmases, we didn't want to sleep. We were so excited and worked up. And we'd always have a Christmas Eve service at the church, and they would give every kid, the deacons of the church would hand out these big bags. They looked huge to us, but they had tangerines and nuts and oranges and all kinds of little candies that were from that period, the cream drops and the orange slices and different things like that. And a lot of those early memories are around that. I remember one thing in particular that stuck out in my mind as early memory was, I guess it comes to mind because of the opening scene of that movie I've mentioned before, the Christmas Story. Is there was a drugstore downtown, and they would give away. They would have a display for boys on one side, display for girls on the other. The boys would have always have a Lionel train, electric train, and you could register to win that train, or the girls could register to win a dollhouse that was in there. And I had been over there and put my greasy nose streaks all over the window of that store every time we went over. We called it over town because we went right over the railroad tracks to be behind the stores and come up. And I wanted that train so bad. And I was in the 4 to 5 year age because I had not started school at that time. And in our dining room, there was a little kind of half-round shelf that mounted to the dining room wall, and it had the telephone on it. And one thing I had never done was I'd never talked on the telephone. And right there before Christmas, the phone rang, and my mother answered it, and she said it was for me. And I I came in there, and I didn't know what to do, and Mother was trying to hand me the receiver. And I took the receiver, and I heard this lady with she was Miss Margaret Stevens, and she and her husband owned the Broadway drugstore where these toys were. She said, "Ronald." She had kind of a deep voice. I think she was a heavy smoker. And she said, "Ronald," and I said, "Uh-huh." And she said, "Ronald, this is Margaret Stevens over at the drugstore." And I said, "Uh-huh." And she said, "Do you know the train in the store window?" And I said, "Uh-huh." And she said, "Well, Ronald, guess what?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "You won the train." And that was the end of my first phone call, because Mother said I just threw the receiver up in the air and went, running around the room, and she grabbed the receiver, and I could hear Miss Margaret laughing. And but that was one of my earliest real clear childhood memories, because I can remember the words and everything from that. And still have that train. It's got a few chips and scratches, and one of the running lights got knocked off when I ran it too fast on the curve, and it went off the dining table. I like to play with it on the dining table because I could squat down and watch it coming, and it looked like a real train when I would get down eye level with the track.
Yeah, it's funny. That kind of reminds me of the fall festival where I won the Super Nintendo that time. That was probably a very similar reaction that I got. I can remember just being so excited. I couldn't have been any happier if I'd won the lottery than when I won the Super Nintendo there. All right. Well, you mentioned some of the sights and sounds of Broadway, and one of my questions on here was if you just closed your eyes and tried to transport yourself back to Broadway, maybe it's the street that your house was on, maybe it's the main street where the drugstore was. If you were to walk down that street in your mind again, what kind of sights and sounds would you see? What does it smell like? What is there in 1950s Broadway?
Well, I was thinking not long ago about one of my favorite, thinking about that main street. Well, it was only one really big, a street. It was the main street. Several streets that crossed into it, but it was Highway 421 that went from Lillington to Sanford, and Broadway was right there on that main road. But again, it's a Christmas scene that I think of because we'd go to church on Wednesday nights at Antioch, which was up at Mamers. And this is in the days before seat belts and all kinds of things that were safety issues. But we would scramble to get to the car first after church, and whoever got there first would get in the back window and lay down and watch. You could see the stars, and you could see street lights and stoplights and things go by over you. And one of my favorite things was coming into Broadway at Christmas. They covered the top of the water tank with colored street lights, starting at the top and coming down. And it was just wrapped up in colored Christmas lights. And I would lay there and look for that. And then they had lights across the street that were like big round balls, I'd say 6-8 inches in diameter probably, that went across the street. About every so many feet they would have a string of them. And it was like magic as we came into town watching those go by overhead. But the little downtown, I can still see it, and most of it is still there. Of course, the business have changed, and some of them, the storefronts have been changed. But it was just a little village, but it had, as you came down the street, there was Mabel McNeil's beauty shop. There was a grocery store. I can't remember the name of it right now. And there was a hardware store. Then Mr. Archie Cameron's grocery store, which is where my parents did grocery shopping and where I picked up groceries to bring home when they sent me to get them. Then the drugstore that the train came from, Stevens Drugstore. Seems like there was another beauty shop down at that end. Across the street was the barber shop, McNeil's barber shop, and where I got my first haircut. And then there was the Bank of Broadway on the corner. And I skipped over an important part, the post office, and that's where my dad worked. That was his base for carrying Route 1 Broadway, which was one route. It was like an 89-mile route. But oftentimes, Mother would pack Dad's lunch while he was putting the mail up in the morning and packing his car, and I'd have to have his lunch over there at the back door of the post office. Most of the time, I caught him behind bringing the mail out and putting it in his car. He called it casing it up. He would put it in boxes so that it was sequenced to the mail route. Mm-hmm. And that's also, I would order things off the back of cereal boxes and things and run over there to that post office to see if my prize had come in. Sort of like the little kid wanting the magic Dakota ring that said, "Drink your Ovaltine." None of the things were ever as good as they were in my imagination.
Right.
But it was kind of magic, just having, these little things you look forward to.
What did you and your siblings and other kids your age do for fun around there?
Well, across the street from us were the Womacks, and that was a family, a mother and her 2 sons that were old. The son and the sister never married. That was Vera Womack and Ernest Womack. And that was like a time capsule. They lived like they'd always lived. They raised chickens and had a milk cow. And there was a pasture beside their house, and then on the other side of their house was a big empty lot. And it stayed mowed like grass, and then the Mansfields were up above that. The Mansfields had 3 kids that were close to our age. Well, actually 4 kids, I'm sorry. There was Jimmy, who was right much older than us, then Tommy, who was my brother's age, and Janet, who was between my brother and I, and then Kathy, who was a little younger than me, but I think a little older than my sister. And so there were 2 boys and 2 girls. And then across the street from them and beside us was the Joneses, who had twin boys that were like my sister's age. And then an older daughter, Mary Lou, who was James and Robert and Mary Lou. And we just all played together. We had a sand pile down at the bottom of the hill in our yard under a big oak tree that everybody get down there sometimes, and we'd make roads and play with toy soldiers and farm sets and things like that. And then, but the most fun we had was playing over in that empty lot and playing games like red light, green light, and I can't think of the others, but games that everybody participated in.
Like Red Rover,
Red Rover,
whatever.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And we'd go in at supper time and then come back out, and there was a street light there at that yard, and we'd play out there at night too until parents had us come in. And
that's a pretty big difference, right? Because these days it seems like you take your kids to a park and maybe they play with each other there, or you set up specified play dates. But it seems much more, this was an everyday occurrence. You turned the kids out so that they weren't in the house, and then you rang a dinner bell, or they just knew to come back in on their own at a certain time.
Yeah.
Would you say that's, was there always a parent present at these things, or did the parents just kind of let their kids run outside?
No, it was just a different time. We just pretty much, we just played out there on our own, and nobody worried about anything. You didn't worry about, somebody snatching a kid or doing anything like that. But parents were always at home, either out on the porch, out in the yard, or, we didn't have air conditioning. So in the summertime, which is, when we did most of the playing, the windows were all open. So parents could hear the kids. And every now and then something, just really extraordinary would happen. I remember the Mansfields had some friends. I don't know where they were from, but they would come down every now and then. And one of those had what they call a midget racer. It looked like, an Indianapolis race car, but it was just small, kid size, not about twice the size of a pedal car. And they would bring that down, and that lot there was big enough that you could really run it like a track. And they would they'd get that little car out and crank it up and let us ride it, drive it around. And of course, I had not driven anything, and the first time I split the crowd open about 3 or 4 times, just, I remember the throttle was a little thing. It wasn't like letting your foot off the gas. You had to let go of the wheel and move it. And when it started going, I had the gas too far up, and my hands were just frozen on the wheel, and I'd be going at the basketball goal, and then I'd turn, and then I'd be going to the crowd, and they were saying, pull the gas back, pull the gas back. I was just going, but it was just different things that would happen out there in that place, and at, different times doing different things. But it was it was really a nice time. In that
it seems like people were just outside more. You mentioned how parents would be outside and there was no air conditioning. And I think it may have been you I had this conversation with, where we talked about how people view pets differently, like dogs specifically. And dogs were, dirty, and you didn't let them in the house, and that's changed in modern times. And I think that's probably because people were outside with the dog more. And then over the years, as people have stayed inside a whole lot more, they've just had to bring the dogs inside with them, because otherwise you would just not have a pet if you just left the dog outside and you never went outside. And with kids, I could see that being similar.
Yeah, I can see that being a real likelihood that it followed that. I know I had a friend, you probably remember him, James Bryan Creech. He was a teacher and a carpenter and a historian that lived down the street here. And he told me one day how air conditioning changed architecture. And I said, what? And he said, and this is along the line of what you're talking about in terms of patterns of behavior. He said, at one time, just about every house had porches, a front porch and a back porch. And he said, we didn't have air conditioning, and the porches were very functional. They shaded. It gave you a place in the shade to sit where you were out of the sun, but it also gave an area where air would be cooler and could be drawn into the house with screen doors and screen windows. And he said, because, in the late afternoons, people would sit out on the porches and people would visit. They'd come up and visit on the porch where they wouldn't come knock on your door and go in the house. And he said that when air conditioning came about, that people started building houses without porches. And when they quit building houses with porches, people stopped walking, and would stop and visit and sit on the porch with you for a few minutes and talk. And it changed the whole social pattern, changed the way houses were built, and caused people to stay inside more, because on those hot summer evenings and afternoons and evenings, they went inside. So it's probably something like that with the dogs. Yeah,
it's just another example of how there can be unintended consequences to technology. And you bring in a new technology and you think, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could stay in our houses as long as we wanted to, because it was always a perfect 70 degrees. Yeah, but you don't realize that takes people off porches where they're accessible to their neighbors who might be walking by, and their neighbors are more likely to be walking by, because if you're going to be outside anyway, you may as well be getting some exercise and walking around. So there's, every time there's a different type of major technological change, we could look at cell phones and television and all sorts of different things like that. There's the benefit that's obvious immediately, but then there's the unintended consequences. E-readers. I love having an e-reader where I can just download a book immediately and read it in something that weighs less than a pound, so I can read a 1,000-page book in this very lightweight little e-reader. But it has had an effect on how many people go into bookstores, and then economically, how do you support the bookstore, bookshop owner, people who make in-person recommendations? It's all now based on an algorithm, or there's a lost personal touch thing, and we miss those things sometimes. There's never a perfect 100% gain. There's usually some kind of trade-off or thing you're missing that you have to weigh out. But once that cat's out of the bag, it's kind of gone. So same thing with air conditioning. I think most of us would not want to go back to a time before air conditioning just so that we could socialize more. But
I was just fixing to say I would give up my porch to keep my air conditioning. That's for sure. The porch. Speaking of the porch, one of the earliest memories that I have. And I know this was about the same age you were talking about. I know I was 3 because my mother told me that I was. But the porch on one end, we were on a hill. the hill went downhill from the side of the house. And we did spend a lot of time out on the porch. But on one side of the porch, it was about an 8-inch step up, or the thickness of the joist on the porch floor from the ground. But the other end, to me, was like a cliff. Like it was high on the other end of it. And I was scared to death when I'd get down close to that edge and look. And of course, it was, if I was on the ground, it was way over my head. And I went back there recently and realized it was, less than 2 foot, but it was, or less than 3 foot anyway. But it was, not that big a drop, but it looked huge to me. And our porch had 4 columns on it, these brick columns halfway up, and then wood above that, and then a wide space with the front steps. And I think it was raining that particular day, and it was on a Sunday afternoon, and Mother had asked Dad to keep an eye on me while she cooked lunch. And he had his Sunday paper out there, and as I said before, Dad, he really focused on things. And he would get into that paper, and he'd look, the rest of the world went away. And they had put my little tricycle up on the porch because of the rain, and so I was riding the tricycle back and forth on the porch. And at some point, I thought it was a good idea to go down the steps on the tricycle. And of course, my mother comes to the door because I'm screaming, because I did a head first over the handlebars into the brick steps down below. Still got a little scar right there on the corner of my eye, which was where it happened. And I can remember my mother fussing at him,
Right.
for not looking after me and not taking care of me. And my recollection of, I don't know why, was that he seemed kind of pitiful to me, because I could tell he looked like he was going to cry because he was so hurt that I was hurt. He was just disappointed that he had let that happen to me. But it's funny how little things like that will stick in your mind.
Yeah, well, speaking of technology, you mentioned a little earlier that the telephone was something that you didn't get to talk into that much. But what, and in a previous episode, you mentioned that your family didn't have a TV. But what is the most technologically advanced thing that you experienced as a kid in the 1950s? Like the newest gee whiz thing, technology that you can think of?
In the 1950s. Well, TV was a gee whiz thing to me, because we didn't have one, and which made me even more fascinated with it. And that was one of my rewards. If I did my chores or did whatever, I could go up to the Mansfields. He and his, Mr. Waving Mansfield, and his partner, I can't remember if it was a brother or who it was a partner though, that had they had an appliance store. And so they always had the newest things in the way of appliances. And they had the first TV in the neighborhood. And so that was a big deal to get to go up there and watch TV. The biggest problem was most of the programs that you'd really want to watch, came at night, which was when you were supposed to be back home and eat dinner and get ready for bed. So Saturday mornings.
You were a fan of the Lone Ranger, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had.
Did you watch that on TV, or was that radio?
My memory there in Broadway was on the radio. And we would gather, all us kids would sit on the floor around the radio in the dining room and listen to that. And it was just, I was just amazed at all the sound effects and the horses running and all this stuff, how they did everything. But it really was better. I think it's one of the ways, I thought it was terrible that Dad wouldn't get a TV. But I think I probably have the creativity that I do, that I've made my living with, to the extent that I have it because it pushed my imagination. You know,
Well, it's like reading. It's sort of like an audiobook for kids. You have to imagine scenes the way that they're described in those radio programs, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I read the To Kill a Mockingbird, and I had that entire town laid out, what the houses looked like, where they were in relationship to each other, you know, where if he was going down the street, going to somewhere, I knew where he had to turn and everything, and what the people looked like and everything. I had just created this little world in my mind as I read that book, and of course a lot of that was due to the descriptive way the author wrote, you know, and I went to see the movie.
Harper Lee?
I guess it was, wasn't it? And I went to see the movie. Gregory Peck was in it. I thought he had the coolest voice, but things were wrong. You know, it was confusing to me because the houses didn't look right and all of these things. And I remember I had a strange reaction to it. I later thought, well, I don't want to read the book before I see movies because of that. But it was laid out. You know, a lot of the houses, because where I lived, were houses that looked like different houses in Broadway.
Yeah. What was the name of your school? Was it still Boone Trail Elementary?
No, the school there was Broadway. It was a K through 12 at the time I was there.
Well, what do you remember about your elementary school years?
Well, I remember how the school was. I remember a lot of my teachers. I'm trying to think. There was one who was the sweetest person, and I cannot think of her name right now. My siblings would probably remember it, but I remember the kindness of of people and the teachers, and you know that the teachers knew the kids and they knew the kids' parents, and you know, it was that. I know Miss Patterson, my first grade teacher, was on my dad's mail route, and her husband was a friend of my dad's. Didn't buy me any favors with her. She was a pretty strict teacher, but I remember the library. I thought that was just a magical place. I loved the library, and when they'd take us on library day to go in and pick out books, and that to me was just a magic time. And I'd never played any kind of sports or anything. Dad wasn't sports minded, and quite frankly never had time to play things like ball and such. And so when I got to school, I didn't know how to swing a bat or do anything like that. And I didn't particularly enjoy the recesses because I was always picked last to be on the team if we were playing ball or something like that, you know. But that was real early on. But it was a nice little school. I remember it was the Broadway Wildcats. You know, baseball was a big thing there, and my brother was on the Little League, and then he was in the I can't think what the next one up from the Little League, you know, where it started getting up to close to the teenagers, 12, 13-year-olds. And some of those guys were pretty serious ball players, but I was the bat boy. And I thought that was something else. And he was in the Cub Scouts, and they did a lot of things like plays, you know, Robin Hood and things like that I just thought were so cool. Mother would make costumes for them. And the school was a nice school. I went there till I was in the 6th grade. And they had this girl in my class that I thought was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen. Her name was Patricia McNeil. And I had it in my mind that she was my girlfriend. And every
in the 6th grade?
No, this is before the 6th grade. It's about the 3rd grade.
Oh, okay.
Or younger. but might have started in the first grade. I don't know, but I just thought she was so cute. And I would get a little heart-shaped box of chocolates at the drugstore every year, and my parents would take me out to her house to take her that candy. And I still remember how awkward it was. It was like this big deal to me. It was serious. And my parents and her parents thought it was so funny, and I can understand that now. It must have been really cute,
right.
But they would put a little suit on me with a little tie and everything, and her parents would know we were coming. They would get her dressed up pretty. And we'd go over there, and I'd hand her the candy. We'd stand there and stare at each other. and it was sort of like the dog chasing the bus, and the bus stops, and he doesn't know what to do. But that's sort of the way I was. But I knew girls were cute. I didn't know how to relate to them or what to do, but that was okay.
The last question I have here, thinking about the 1950s, very iconic period in American history, post-war. It has been depicted in many pieces of fiction, culturally significant pieces of fiction, TV shows like Happy Days. You've already mentioned the Christmas Story, and that was a television special movie. But even movies, Back to the Future, they go back to the 1950s. So it's not hard, at least it wasn't for my generation growing up. There was 1950s nostalgia in our media constantly. I never lived in the 50s, but I felt like the 50s had permeated culture in such a way that we saw it in movies and TV and music, and the influence of Elvis and all these things. So I'm curious to know from your perspective, even though Broadway, little tiny town, probably less than 1,000 people at that point in time, maybe it's not the perfect place to ask this question, but how close do those things come to depicting what it was really like to live in the 1950s based on your recollection?
A lot of the things in the movies I didn't experience firsthand in the 50s because it just wasn't going on in that little town where I was. Say going Back to the Future and the drive-ins and the soda shops and things like that. The little drugstore was the closest thing we had, and you go in there and get your fountain cokes and your orangeades and lemonades and things like that. I do remember the girls wearing the poodle skirts, sweating the little flouncy poodle skirts and the saddle Oxfords, and I remember this.
And what was the poodle skirt? Was the poodle skirt made by a company that made poodle skirts, or were these just you put your own poodle on a skirt?
It was just
and your mom made a poodle skirt for you.
I'm sure there were some done that way, but from what I knew, it was just a design trend. It was the hot thing, and they sold these skirts in the clothing stores, and they would have poodles embroidered on them, with their leashes and different designs like that. But all of them had like French poodles. Mm-hmm. And you had the black and white saddle Oxfords that they wore with the little white socks. Ankle socks or anklets or whatever they were. But the movie Christmas Story was probably the closest. I mean, I felt like I was watching a flashback. Having a flashback of what life was like, other than, I think I mentioned before, I never heard my dad curse like the father did on there. And I never had to have my mouth washed out with soap, but I had friends who did. So all the stuff on there was familiar one way or the other, but it was really an idyllic time. You didn't have anybody, from my perspective and where I was, that people didn't seem to resent each other. People seemed to get along together better. There was a feeling of neighborliness and people coming together and helping each other. Like everybody just kind of watched out for each other's kids, wherever it was, and would straighten you out if you did something wrong. They'd step in there and get you straightened out.
Seems to me like with the Christmas Story, you brought that up of, oh, this is so close to what I remember it being like. I think that speaks to probably how homogenous that kind of experience was compared to today, where families look a whole lot different from one to the other, and thus your experience as a child could look a whole lot different from somebody else that's in your school. Seems to me, from again somebody who wasn't there, but seems to me like there was a level of relatability that your generation had with one another that became more and more strained as time went on. It gets harder and harder to have similar experiences. Oh, my mom washed my mouth out with soap, that kind of thing. Like, it just seems like there's more diversity of experience, and in some ways that's a good thing. In some ways it means it can be a little bit harder to relate to one another than it was back then, because if everybody had a very kind of similar-ish experience at home, then you can much more easily relate to those people. But that may just be me. I'm speculating. I don't know if that's the way it actually was, but
some of the things in that movie, if you remember, where the little boy wanted the air rifle, the Red Ryder, and his mother said, "No, you'll shoot your eye out," and the teacher told him he'd shoot his eye out. And my brother wanted one really bad, and mother told him time and time again, "No, you can't have one of those." And we'd love to go over to Harry Stevens' house. He lived over near Lake Watson, and his mom would call sometimes and ask if we could come over. He was an only child, and his parents owned that drugstore, so he had every toy there was in the world. And we loved to go over there because we could get to play with these things. And one Christmas, he had gotten a Red Ryder BB gun, and Eldon was finally going to get to shoot one. And they set something up for a target, and he lay down like in a prone position and shot, and the BB popped off, or whatever it was he shot, and hit him right under the eye, just like, it did that little kid. I mean, exactly like it. And when I saw that movie, I was like, I can't believe it. From them standing there at that drugstore window looking in and the opening scene to my brother getting hit, and then, oh gosh, Mom was going to ask because it was a big red welt,
Right.
But it was just, I don't know, it seemed like you said, it was more relatable, that there weren't a whole lot of differences in experiences that people
Well, I mean,
had
just
pretty
in
much
media,
commonality.
we talked about the Lone Ranger. I mean, a lot of people watch that. For my generation, it was watching the Power Rangers. There was only a few options for kids to watch this TV show or that TV show or radio show in your case. And today, it's just, there's 100 different options that kids can watch. So they're going to probably grow up, and some of them were fans of this thing, and some of them never heard of that thing, and they were fans of something totally different. So I think back to the whole like technology as we advance, sometimes there's unintended consequences, and maybe it's a little harder to find those shared experiences, like shooting your eye out with a Red Ryder BB rifle. Clearly, it was common enough thing and a common enough concern that they put it into a TV movie like that. So, well, anyway, that's pretty much all we've got for the 1950s. Real quick to wrap up this episode, we haven't done the What's Going On With Us segment in a little while. So do you have any books, movies, TV shows, music, live concert events, anything that you've been doing recently?
No, I really don't. I haven't been to a movie in a while. There've been several out over Christmas that I wanted to see, but hadn't gotten to. But how about yourself?
Well, you'll have to remember them and get to streaming whenever they're available for streaming. For me, I will say the TV show on Apple TV Plus. Emily started watching Severance, and I've seen The second season just came out. I've seen it advertised for a couple of years. The first season, I think, came out a couple of years ago, and it looked dystopic and stressful, and I was not at all interested. And the name Severance made me think, based on the pictures of this guy, I was like, oh, is this about a guy that gets fired and then he goes postal or something? So it just didn't look like my kind of thing. But the premise of the show is this company comes up with a way to sever your work life from your home life. So there's like a separate person that lives in your head. You don't have any of your memories of your personal life when you're at work. And then when you're at home, you don't have any memories of the work life. So it's like there's a clear cut in your personality. So the idea of work-life balance taken to an extreme in a sci-fi sort of way, but it seems to be set in the past. It's not clear exactly what the time period is, but it looks like maybe the 1970s or 80s, and yet there's this futuristic company. And at first that premise sounds pretty like straightforward, but then you start to think about it and you're like, oh gosh, those separate people that you create, the work people, they're just at work all the time. They go in the elevator and the next thing they consciously remember is coming down the elevator, and they're back at work again. So they never get to go home. What would that be like? It's done pretty well. And it's one of those things where I wonder, are they going to be able to tie everything together to make it make sense in the end? Probably not, but I'm enjoying it so far. So I'll keep watching season 2 and see how that goes. So that's it. Thank you for joining us for episode 6. We will be back next week at the same time in the same place.